I am going to take the liberty of going ahead and getting started. Just by saying thank you guys for letting me be here with y'all today. Of all of the sort of areas of journalism that we could be talking about. Oh, I mean, if people need to be perched wherever to eat, I don't want to disrupt your lunch. I know I have your ears. Social justice journalism, I feel like, is, one of the reasons that so many of us are drawn to journalism. And so interested in, talking a little bit about kind of the bigger picture of engagement, at least in my view, and why it's important for journalism today, but also hopefully to open up a conversation about questions that you guys have with respect to the roles that you either have now in newsrooms or hope to be bringing or arriving at in newsrooms beyond school. And I kind of wanted to start, well, I guess a little bit of background for people who may not know me before we kind of get into it. I am at the Texas Tribune now, as John mentioned. I work on all things audience, really trying to grow our audience and figure out what engagement means for a newsroom. It's essentially the biggest state house news bureau in the country. We have more than 50 journalists now who are dedicated to covering Texas politics and policy. Before that, I worked with Terry, who is somewhere around here, at ProPublica. I spent about 4 years there working on investigative journalism with an amazing team there and really figuring out how we could not only grow ProPublica to kind of be more of a standalone platform who could draw our own audience and not necessarily rely on other big name news organizations for people to kind of find our work, but also really how to figure out how to get some of those people really invested in the work that we were doing. And he's gonna deep dive on that, I'm sure, with many of you guys later. So that will be very exciting. And before that, I was at the Washington Post, and I started out as a reporter. I went to the University of Texas at Austin. I graduated. I was the first graduating class after 9/11 and thought that I would be a reporter and really fell into digital journalism by accident because that was the first big contraction in the newspaper industry that I experienced, and as we all know, it's been contracting ever since, pretty much. But that's how I got from there to here. And I will say that the Texas Tribune is interesting because it feels like a real fusion of a lot of the work that I have done in all of these different places, in the sense that we are trying to kind of maybe be like the Washington Post of Texas in the focus on politics and policy. But we have a nonprofit mission, and that really kind of shapes the way that we approach and tackle things. So we'll talk a little bit more about what engagement means at the Texas Tribune in a bit. But first, I kind of wanted to start with where we are as an industry, and we've already been hearing about trust. I've heard it in this last great discussion, and you've probably been talking about it even before that this morning. But obviously, this is a really huge moment for our country, but also for journalism. And there's been a lot of hand-wringing and furrowed eyebrows over the last many months in many newsrooms about, how we arrived at this particular moment in time with, really newsrooms misjudging and miscalculating, the outcome of the presidential election in a huge way. And I think a lot of that discussion post-election has focused on the causes of this miscalculation, and to the degree that we had really terrible data that was pointing us in toward a different outcome, to whether there's a sort of this proliferation of fake news and the extent to which that was really clouding people's conversations and distorting reality, and the extent to which Facebook as a platform really drove and fueled that fake news and misinformation that proliferated throughout the campaign. And of course, there was also the first time that we had the federal government saying that a foreign country was meddling in the election, which seems like it was a big deal. That's kind of a big deal, yes. So all of those things are really big problems, yes. But what I want to point out, and I'm sure that you guys have seen this poll over and over again, my point is that we didn't just suddenly arrive at this sort of disconnect, right, between what we judged the outcome or the story to be and what maybe the public sort of perceived in what they were hearing or getting from the media. And so, actually, it looks like I'm a little bit truncated here, but this is the Gallup poll on, the public's declining trust in media. Oh, this is really going to irritate me, and it's cutting off. But the point is, it started, from the high in '99 of 55% to the low 40s. I mean, that didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in one election cycle. This has been an ongoing problem that the media has been ignoring. It's taken this election to sort of jar everyone awake and say, oh, maybe this is something we want to pay attention to. And so where I think these are kinds of the values that when we see those opinion polls and we are trying to kind of figure out, well, where is the disconnect? Because this is what we're raising, young journalists of today, and these are the core values that we espouse and we really adhere to in our newsrooms. We know that, accuracy is quite important to us, that fairness is quite important to us, that transparency is quite important to us, and these are the things that we're drilling in to journalists and trying to kind of keep to in what we produce. And I'm certain that, most of us really are doing that and working on that. But the public is sort of seeing, or at least we have seen the conversation shift where, where we think that we are producing things that are accurate, there's now been this perception that there is something such as alternative facts. Like, I don't even, saying that out loud is just weird, but like where we see facts, others see alternative facts, and where we see fairness, others see bias, and where we see transparency, people see anonymous leaks and anonymous sources and a real opacity of the work that we produce. And so there is a significant problem. And I guess what I wanted to say, and I don't have Kendrick Lamar to back me up, maybe you guys can play that later. I won't be trying to sing any of that. I don't think you want to hear me pretend to be Kendrick Lamar. But I do think that a value that we could be much more explicit about discussing, probing, instilling in journalists is humility. So thinking about humility coming from the Latin word for to be low, i.e., and I can kind of think back to, and I don't know how all of you decided to get into journalism, but I remember the first time that I got like a hot scoop, even just as a college journalist, and having a question about, I think there was, who was it? Henry Kissinger was supposed to be coming to campus to give a speech, and they canceled the speech, claiming that the Secret Service basically said that it would be unsafe, and somebody like called in a tip to the Daily Texan, and I remember picking up the phone and calling I don't know if it was like a spokesman for the Secret Service, and basically they called bullshit and said we never said that. And I was like, holy crap, like I can pick up the phone as this college kid and ask a bunch of questions, and these really powerful people are gonna give me answers. And there's like a thrill to that, right? There's a thrill to kind of having access to facts and information and people in power that the public certainly has a right to, but because you pick up the phone and say that you're a reporter and you're asking these really pertinent and annoying questions that people are gonna be responsive to you, it puts you on a high, right? And so as much as we are sort of in this business because we want to do good for and by the people, I think that we should probably admit that there is something of a power that we hold and that, definitely can lead us to forget, where we are or the proximity that we should be keeping to the people that we are aiming to serve. And so while we could think about and keep talking about bad polling and fake news and Facebook and how all of those things really contributed to, the mistrust that the public has in the media right now, I would really rather think about the fact that maybe I was wrong or we were wrong, and not in but we post corrections all the time wrong, but you didn't even recognize me as a community or a voice in the story to begin with. How many corrections do you see appended to stories that came from someone in the public that was like, but the whole premise for that story was wrong? Like those kinds of corrections, if news organizations actually cared about them or posted them, I mean, how many of those would there be? That's why I love Margaret Sullivan's like monocle column about all of the New York Times On It stories that are completely not on it. Or maybe you're listening to those populations and communities, but you just didn't see something because you were so focused on your own tack or approach to the story, right? So I guess what I wanted to think about today and to raise questions for, with this group of people is not getting so caught up in some of these really big picture problems that seem intractable, which I'm not saying, by the way, don't deserve attention and investigation and solving. They do. And so God bless First Draft and all of these other organizations who are really trying to tackle some of those big picture problems. But I guess I want to talk about what are the values and the questions that we can ask ourselves as individual journalists to make a difference in our newsrooms. Because I really feel like for engagement to matter and to kind of change the way that we approach journalism, it has to be also a ground-up thing within the journalism community where we're all taking responsibility for this approach and not expecting managers or editors or other technologists or platforms or other people to solve these problems. So that leads me back to the Texas Tribune, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the questions that I feel like we could all be asking, but how I'm thinking them through at the Texas Tribune. So I'm the Chief Audience Officer, which I interpret to mean as taking this mission, which is the mission of the Texas Tribune. It's the only member-supported, digital-first, nonpartisan media organization that informs Texans and engages with them about public policy, politics, government, and statewide issues. And what I love so much about this mission statement, and especially that, I had nothing to do with creating it, the fact that engagement is explicitly in the mission is awesome. Like, it was one of the reasons that I was just so excited to be at the Texas Tribune. And so I like to think these are the kinds of questions that I think help me meet that mission in collaboration with all of the other amazing people that I work with. And so if we kind of had to take the who, what, when, where, why questions and that inverted pyramid and like that old school approach to journalism, and if we had to kind of take those questions and think about how do they apply to we as humble journalists engaging our audiences to tell stories together, I would start with the who, right? And I would start with who am I actually doing this for? And you don't have to be in a strategy position, you don't have to be an editor, you don't have to be a big deal where you are to be asking yourself this question. Who am I reporting, writing, or creating this for? And so one of the big who questions that we're talking about right now at the Texas Tribune is, who are we informing about politics and policy? So this is a look, and this is a perennial, every time the ledge is in session, it's in every 2 years the legislature's in session. We're currently sort of hurtling towards the finish line of the 85th ledge right now. Alexa Ura does a great sort of demographics take on the legislature. So this is what the legislature looks like. And as you can see, so people of color are sort of in color and the rest are white. You can see that Texas, the population of Texas, is obviously now a majority minority population, and that's not something that, the legislature is not in line there. And I'm sad to say that the Texas Tribune readership does not reflect the population of Texas either. And so at a time when we're all trying to figure out, well, what does engagement mean and how do I measure it? Are we talking about demographics? Who are we really trying to serve? And when I look at our mission and I think about engaging and informing Texans on policy, that means everyone. And so if we're serving a majority white population, that's like the very first question I want to raise and figure out how do we tackle together. And so that's an ongoing conversation that we're having. And it's not an easy problem to solve, right? Where can I engage and find those people? So at the Texas Tribune, we reach about 1.5 million unique users every month now. So we're a growing platform. We have our own website, but we are, started out based in Austin. We rely on some other ways to try to really branch out into the state. We're still kind of a lean and mean machine, but partnerships, we have a woman who works on partnerships who helps us get republished. It's similar to the ProPublica model where everything that we publish is free for other people to take. Same at the Texas Tribune, and so people can reprint us through Creative Commons. Other newspapers often pick up our political coverage. We are in print in a great partnership with the community impact newspapers in Texas, so that's been a great way to sort of get beyond the Austin bubble. Social media has been a really great way for us to get outside of our bubble of insiders and people who are already in the know about the legislature. Events, and events to me are journalism, right? Like thinking about ways that we can tell stories and engage people in those stories and talk about issues. The Texas Tribune has every year more than 50 events where we, not just in Austin, we could be in the Valley or in Waco or in West Texas, talking, bringing the public together with elected officials and policy experts where they can talk to them directly about what's happening in the Capitol. And certainly mobile and social kind of play a big role, but maybe all of those places aren't sufficient in helping us get to where people are in rural areas or in poorer communities. And so should we be overly relying on our phones? That's a question mark. I don't know. Maybe we should be doing more with SMS, and we've done some experimenting along those lines. What do they need? And did I even ask what they need? I think is actually a really important, and I know it's like seeing this up here, it's a really obvious question, but I really don't think that it's one that we're accustomed to asking ourselves as journalists. We are following trends and conversations and our own instincts and interests, and I think rarely do we actually stop and ask what the audience that we are targeting wants and needs. So one of the ways, and Terry's gonna, again, deep dive, so I won't. One of the really basic ways that we do this is by asking people to help us with the stories and the topics that we know are important to us, public education being one of the most widely read issues that we cover on the site. And instead of just sort of covering things from the policy, what's coming or emanating out of the legislature, actually asking parents, what is your experience? What do you think? School choice was a hot button issue. It was one of the governor's, top priorities this session. It was sort of dead on arrival in the House, but before the vote and the hearings on that really heated up, we wanted to talk to parents to really figure out, well, what do they think? What do they want in terms of opportunities to use potentially public funds to put their kids in different schools? And so call-outs are one way that we do that, where we, I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with this by now because I feel like it's become a lot more common, where just instead of asking people for quick opinions about things, we're asking them for data points about their lives with respect to the stories that we cover. But also kind of testing our assumptions about, once we've sort of maybe gathered some ideas within the newsroom and from readers, like, what is it that we're gonna build to meet that need? And so one thing that we have done in the last few months is created this thing called Beta Lab, where we have a list of volunteers where we can kind of go in and do more deep dive research with our audience to help get their help in shaping what it is that we're reporting or we're building with them. So this is one great example where we wanted to use a bot to help maybe make the legislative session more accessible to people who are not already sort of obsessed and already reading all of the ins and outs of legislative news. And we thought, obviously Facebook is a growing market for news consumers, and how can we maybe reach a younger audience, a different audience of people who are not already obsessed with the legislature. And so we did a survey with existing readers, people who are already sort of in the Tribune, to kind of test the idea with them that we recruited through this Beta Lab project. And we asked them questions about, well, what would you want to know about the legislature if we were going to do a thing like this? How engaged are you? How plugged into this story are you already? Like, are you super obsessed already? How much, where should we be putting your feedback in terms of the realm of people who we already have captured or maybe desire to capture, how would you want to get this information? Anyway, this is just a short snippet of the survey or the questions that we actually asked people. But then we got some validation back from those people that they would like to be better informed and that they didn't have a lot of time, and we needed to be respectful of, maybe not where we're accustomed on our existing kind of channels, Twitter and Facebook and whatever, of just programming to program and get our stuff out there. People didn't want to be necessarily bombarded. So like, how can you leverage those channels to cut through the noise and not just be piling on? And we also got validation that Facebook might be a good place to try this. That people were using Facebook Messenger potentially a little bit more than SMS. And so we got enough validation of this idea that we went ahead and kind of proceeded building out this bot. And I'll show you a little bit more about it in a minute. The other question, and again, with respect to your role, maybe you're not in kind of design, dev, engineering mode, maybe you're more of a reporter, but asking how you can best report, right, and create that thing to meet that need and satisfy that audience. This is how we did it for Page. We, after we did a couple of rounds of research with Beta Lab volunteers, and if anybody wants to know, we also surveyed people outside of our audience with Mechanical Turk, but I won't nerd out. You can ask me about that if you're interested. We developed a new way of sort of broadcasting really quick hit updates through this Facebook Messenger bot. Her name is Paige, sort of like a legislative page, but not quite. And on Mondays and Fridays, we give people sort of the quick rundown on big stories. And so when you sign up, she tells you what you're gonna get. And she also says, I'm not just gonna talk at you, you can ask me questions too. And so this is one of our super users, Alex Mead. I think he's like a junior at the University of Texas because I've stalked him a little, and I'm going to talk to him when this project is over because I want to learn all about how his experience was. So he texted in. I'm obsessed actually. I like watch how people are reading our stories in Facebook Messengers, and it's fascinating. He texted in and he was like, ask Trib. And so we said, well, what do you want to know about the legislature? And he said, I want to know about this thing called the Senate Intent Calendar. So I already know he's like a super user because I didn't even know what the Senate Intent Calendar was. Rick Perry gives you a little round of applause when you ask a good question. And then we tell them what to expect. Like, this is not Instabot. I'm not Quartz, and I don't have a million developers like plugging your questions into a thing that's going to like spit out this artificial intelligence answer. So we manage expectations and we say, good question, let me get this to a person who can look into it and I'll get back to you. And so we've kind of set expectations, and it's just like a whole different way about thinking about writing for this kind of interaction on it. And it's writing a story, but in this very interactive way that's not anything like Facebook, like you would program on your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed. And so what we wound up doing, I think, a couple weeks later, Alex Samuels did a really great post about what the Senate Intent Calendar is all about, and somebody noticed, not instant, but hopefully insightful, and this was the interaction where when we actually reported out, we call them text-splainers. We have all kinds of really catchy names at the Texas Tribune. Alex did a great text-splainer, and we put that back out there to the whole community. Like, we learned something along the way, and we're gonna put it back out there. We hope you learned something too. And then we re-encouraged people to keep asking us great questions. So that's just one little look at how we designed and wrote something differently to meet that need. This is on a really basic level, right? This is that text-splainer, and this is like, I don't even know which version of it was. Alex did a really great job of going and finding all of the really expert people who could explain what the Senate Intent Calendar was and why it mattered, but it was still really written for people at the legislature, and like constantly reminding yourselves that you're not writing for those, you're not writing for the people who are gonna send in the correction. You don't want the correction from them, but you still need to build enough confidence in the subject material that you're able to write it for the person who wrote in, or better yet, probably for the person who didn't even know to write in, but should probably really know why the Senate Intent Calendar matters and why the Lieutenant Governor can override anything that's on the Senate Intent Calendar anyway, so what's the point of it? That's what we learned. So language, like it's a really fundamental thing, but it's a really important thing. Is this language accessible to the people that I intend it for? Or am I really writing so that the people who are my sources aren't gonna be annoyed and complaining that I didn't get it right? Like, let's just say getting it right is the bare minimum expectation, yes, but how am I delivering this information? It also might be rethinking the way that you conceive of an event in our case. So this is what a typical Texas Tribune of the 50+ events that I mentioned, every year looks like. It's a bunch of people at the front of a room in suits, and Evan Smith is an incredible moderator, an incisive questioner, and there's so much incredible conversation and content that we get out of these events with people who are shaping policy in Texas that affects millions of people. Very valuable, but if you're trying to kind of change the dynamic and engage an audience that is not otherwise engaged in this conversation, you're gonna have to design it differently. So this is an example of one approach that we've started testing this year, where instead of having an event where it's a panel of people who are mainly talking at you, and there's like 5 minutes at the end for a question and answer, this entire forum was designed for parents and teachers for them to talk about the issues that matter to them about, public schools in Texas, including testing, including school choice. And it took a lot of work, and it was a totally different model, and it took a lot of proactive outreach and finding and curating the right voices and people to come. And we had 3 big questions, and we broke them out into tables, and it was just completely different than our other event style, but it was much more about the target audience and giving them the platform and the opportunity to talk through their experiences and kind of surface insights together. And it was a markedly different conversation than the one that we had the next day, which was the traditional event style, where it was really sounded a lot more like what you would hear on the House floor or the Senate floor, right? Policy from a different perspective. So shaking up how it is that you design or create things to reach and engage the target audience, and then also thinking about when you plan to re-engage those folks to keep it going, to keep the conversation going, to figure out if what you're doing is working. This is another one that I think journalists really don't think about, because we're so deadline oriented, like, you've done this thing and you, like, thanks be to God that you got it out and it was accurate, and then you were able to get on to the next thing, because we're constantly on this sort of deadline churn. But for engagement, like, you really need to plan for reconnecting and re-engaging those people. You can't just sort of set it and forget it. And so this is just one example from that event. Like, okay, well, what could we have done differently to really improve the quality of the conversation? What did we miss? What could we do better? And so we're constantly doing surveys and asking questions to learn more about the people who engaged. Also to be able to track over time if we're moving the needle, right, with who's even participating, if we're trying to kind of, again, change the demographics of the people who are participating and things like that. Giving them a space to keep the conversation going. We're hoping to do more with Facebook, again, with public education in particular, and giving them a place to keep the conversation going. And why? Just because the current model is obviously broken. Like, I feel strongly that engagement can play a really big role in increasing the trust that our audience has in us. The more that we are in conversation with them, not just after we've published the story, but as we're creating those stories, the more invested they are in us and what we're producing. And because we certainly can't outsource any of this to the Facebooks and the other platforms that are sort of, playing a much bigger role in how the public consumes information. So it looks a little bit washed out on this, but basically what we're trying to do is, if this was the sort of the basic emphasis at the Texas Tribune before, which was to inform across all of these different platforms, we're trying to kind of think of new ways to create a virtuous loop where we are engaging the audience and having them help shape what it is that we produce to inform. So one way that we're doing that, and This is, again, modeled off of a lot of the work that I did at ProPublica, and they've got 2 engagement reporters now, which is amazing. We have Alex Samuels, who's our new community reporter, and her job is gonna be basically to help us build out this virtuous cycle. So instead of just informing people with all of our expert knowledge, we're going to do a better job of expanding who we are listening to. That may be through social listening, it may be through groups that already exist, either grassroots groups or online groups. It might be going to actual physical places, libraries, schools. Where do we need to be to kind of find that target audience? Incorporating what we hear by being more present in those places into the reporting that we do, using that to kind of launch more explicit invitations to those people to contribute. Again, Terry and Julia are going to talk to you more about what that looks like, but like placing calls to action really like across your platform to give people sort of hooks in to either tell their stories, give you tips, give you ideas, and then have all of that really help shape what you're producing so that what you're producing reflects and the audience that you're trying to engage, where they actually see themselves in the coverage. And it's not just, I mean, in our case, right, we don't want our politics and policy coverage only to reflect the perspectives of the people at the top who are sort of making all the decisions, but that it should also reflect the people who are sort of impacted directly by those decisions. And so it's starting to happen at the Texas Tribune. This would not necessarily, actually I know this wouldn't have been considered a story before we got here and started mixing things up. 4 things Texans wanted to know about the 4 things Texans wanted the legislature to know about public schools was a post that Alex did as a result of that discussion, that event that we held. And it was a markedly different kind of perspective on this special education discussion that was happening otherwise. We're doing it with a series of Q&As where we're, again, trying not to take things for granted and assume that people know how to contact their lawmakers or assuming that they know how to get involved, where we're kind of 2 birds and 1 stoning it with this call out where we're asking people to tell us about the groups that they're involved in across the state of Texas, because that helps us build a network that we can listen to better and that we can even put that list out to the public so that if you wanted to get involved in a particular topic or in a particular place, you have more information and resources with which to do that. And so we hope that all of this will help us obviously create better journalism, but this again reinforces our model too, which is, part of, what keeps us in business is people actually donating and giving us money that makes it possible for us to do the journalism that we do. And so, this is Lorena Reyna, and I met her actually at an event a couple of weeks ago, and sort of like Alex Mead was with the Facebook bot. She's another super user who, had an experience with the Texas Tribune and got hooked and is a constant presence. Like, you want basically to have invested enough time in your engagement, whether as an individual reporter or with whatever your role is, that you do start to see those regulars. Like, yes, you're always gonna have the trolls and the chaos and comments and whatever, but there will also be names and faces that come back to you, and if they appreciate and are served so much by your work that they want to invest in that work through donations, for us, all the better. That's it. So, any questions? Would happy to take any questions. Also, just to hear about what you guys are doing or what you would like to be doing.
So I work at a Pittsburgh Tribune Review, Greensburg Tribune Review, Pittsburgh area, 3 newspapers, we're covering them. We're nowhere close to doing anything like this. So my question is, where should you start? I mean, obviously you guys have been developing this for years. Where's a good place for newsrooms to start if they're not doing any engagement to this level?
Well, it's deceptive. Events actually has been a core part of our model from the beginning, but a lot of the other engagement has really only happened in the year that I've been there. I mean, I did this at ProPublica, and we've been inventing this stuff. I feel like that's kind of like my thing now in newsrooms, is to kind of go and bake this model in. I don't have a huge team. So like, I think it takes the will, and I think it takes like a willing partner. And my best willing partners are usually the reporters, actual journalists. I'm also grateful for the fact that I don't have to, while I think that Alex Samuels being our community reporter is a really great investment, because it's easier sometimes to prove the model when you can focus someone on that work. But it was important to me that she was considered and is a reporter. She just happens to do a lot of this engagement and outreach that's like baked into her job. So she's gonna be building lists and on social media and doing email outreach in a way that a traditional reporter might not, but she's still a reporter, right? She's just sort of emphasizing a different toolkit. And by the same token, the other reporters in my newsroom are hungry to do more of this type of journalism that reflects the people and those real people stories. So I don't think it's impossible, actually. I think, if I were you, I would maybe start small and instead of trying to say my entire newsroom is gonna do engagement, pick a story or a policy area, or I'm not sure exactly what you guys cover, and come up with a team of 2 or 3 people who just wants to work together to use a few different tools to kind of move the needle and say, yes, maybe we're covering a story on the environmental impacts of X. And we had been doing it by going to city council meetings and talking to developers and all of that, but say that we want to exhaustively document the impact on a population and define the population and deep dive with that population and build into the process, creating spaces physically in the community and online where you give yourselves goals. I want to tell at least one awesome story a month that percolated from that community that I wouldn't have done otherwise. Julia's going to give you some good tools that you could use to make that happen later, maybe. Yes.
As somebody who's a member of a traditional news media organization that's trying to survive, I'm interested in how engagement has also driven your fiscal model for how you survive online, and the whole membership supported concept, if you could talk a little bit about that.
So we have a little bit of a different model than ProPublica, which is majority sort of major donors, and the Tribune model's more diversified, where I'd say maybe half is big gifts, either from philanthropy, so or philanthropy, and then also from foundations, so grants and things like that. And then another big chunk is the money that we make through sponsorship, and that also includes sponsorship of our events. And so it's interesting, we have this sort of hybrid where certainly the philanthropy and foundation grant making is a very specific to nonprofit, but April Hinkle is with the best of, the business in terms of getting, sponsorship money for a lot of the work that we're doing. And I think that the membership quotient is never going to be as big as either of those, but I think that, I've always described my role in audience as sort of being half about hustle and half about relationships. And so I still do need to worry about scale and reach and making sure that we're maximizing our audience. I do think that actually helps us with the accessibility and diversifying the audience as well, but I'm working then across the newsroom with events, with membership, with product to figure out how we define engagement, and we're leaning more towards it being okay, these are the people that are opting into emails and social and having persistent relationships with us, because that then narrows the pool that we eventually get into becoming sustaining members. And so I don't think, it's not a prerequisite that you must be a member in order to, derive value from what we do, and that's not what we're saying. It's not a zero-sum game, but we hope that the experience is so awesome that you will want to. And we want to create that experience regardless. So it's hopefully an all boats rise situation.
All right, last question right here.
So on the education side, one of the hardest things for new journalists is the gap between what they think is the necessary base information to go out and report a story and what they know, which is less. And so they're uncomfortable in that space of ignorance. And so they do a lot of puffing and they become kind of officious. And that's their reporting persona to cover up the fact that they think they don't know enough to even be at the table. How do you get them past that and essentially to embrace their ignorance in a place of humility that's still functional as a reporter?
I feel like editors are the chief reinforcers of that false sort of sense of fear. I have seen a lot of editors, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. We've sort of, again, like honed these newsrooms at being able to quickly make judgments about news because we have deadlines to meet with all, and where we have to feel confident, again, about those accuracy, fairness, transparency values. And so, you know, it's sort of a formula that we need to rely on in order to like make deadlines. So I get it, but at the same time, it also sometimes leads us to see an idea or hear a question and dismiss it because we think that's not news or that's not valuable. And I think this is where, to me, it becomes a cultural thing where you do need support from your leadership and editors so that when you come to an editorial meeting with a different idea about how to tell a story and to say, for that environmental impact project, instead of us saying that we're going to exhaustively research and come and comb through and, you know, identify and then synthesize and present all of the facts, to say we're going to do the ProPublica model or the Dave Barentold, who I love for winning the Pulitzer because he kind of validates this model too, right? Is saying I'm going to be more open about the process of reporting this story, and understanding the story along with my audience is something that I will also put in the public domain because that's valuable. And so I think some of it comes down to framing. That's one way that I've had success in newsrooms at helping other editors or people who come from sort of a different framework be a little bit more understanding of and supportive of, is saying, okay, maybe let's just not call it a news story. Let's call it something else. I also think taking advantage of platforms, that is actually, news editors are way more comfortable maybe with you doing that on Twitter and Facebook than right on the site. So maybe experimenting in other places and proving out, you know, proof of concept, and then figuring out how to kind of bake it into the main product, your site or a newsletter or whatever. Maybe that's another way to go. I mean, Barentold is like my best shining example of someone who didn't wait for an editor to tell him. He just went on Twitter and started asking his followers to help him tell a story. So. No Kendrick Lamar, sorry. Thank you guys so much.